Let's talk more about Russia's influence over energy prices. That's one of the most important undercurrents to the talks in Brussels, and really, whenever we talk about the war. Alaska Republican Senator Dan Sullivan joins us now. He serves on the Armed Services Committee. And one of the first things you say, Senator, is that from day one, the White House has been focused on killing the production of American energy. And I will grant you that the rhetoric was there, and even before President Biden, before the election, when he said, I will kill the fossil fuel industry. There was the executive order in January of 2021 that outlined things. But that's a lot of rhetoric. You're in Alaska, where this is a major export. Specifically, what has the Biden administration done in terms of permitting or leasing or pipelines? Concrete examples of what the Biden administration has done that you feel has made it harder to produce.
Well, Joe, thanks. And you mentioned it, Joe Biden, when he was on the campaign trail, said he was going to end fossil fuels. And I think they've actually really tried to do that. Let me give you a couple examples. You mentioned there was, right when they came in, day one, there was a 60-day moratorium on anything, and I mean anything, with regard to federal lands. All stopped. 60 days after that, the Assistant Secretary in charge of Lands and Minerals said that any application to drill, these are thousands of permits to do the basic work on leases, which have been traditionally approved at lower levels in federal government officials in Alaska. This Assistant Secretary said she has to approve everything. Right now, there are 4,600 of these applications to drill stuck in the headquarters of D.C. When Joe Biden says he's going to do everything he can to help limit energy prices, this is exactly one of the examples. They should get rid of that memo, that authority right now, and start approving these applications to drill, over 4,000 of them. So that's one big thing. And then at the national level, Joe, and you guys see it, you know, in order to get the nod to be a federal regulator, think about it. You have to commit to the holy war against energy. Think about the nominees they put forward for comptroller of the currency, for the Fed with Miss Raskin, the SEC chairman, even the FERC. They are all putting out rules that are anti-energy. This, of course, hurts investment, and it sends a signal that the federal government doesn't support energy production. So it's a huge issue, and from day one, they have been focused on killing energy infrastructure, production, and I'll say one thing, they're getting a big assist from a lot of our woke and I think weak financial institutions. We just had an announcement recently from AIG. They said, we're not going to invest in America's Arctic. Well, that's Alaska. Here's a company that's been helping prop up the Chinese Communist Party for decades, and now they're blackballing investment in Alaska.
So AIG
is ridiculous.
AIG is a public company, but it's in it's the free market, what AIG wants to do.
Of course, it's the free market.
But would you say that they're responding to pressure from the government to enforce this ESG? So where is it actually coming from? If it's just AIG, they can do whatever they want. And if an oil company decides they don't want to drill, they can do it because they don't think they can get their money back on it or it's not feasible. You could make an argument that those are market forces. But then again, market forces are only as good as the regulations and the government oversight that are controlling. We've seen so many examples in the past how government can screw up free markets. What do you think it is?
Well, I think it's a combination of several things. Like I said, the federal regulators that the Biden administration has put forward, a lot having to do with finance, right? Comptroller of the currency, SEC chief. They're all putting out signals. I mean, heck, some of them are just blatant. We want to bankrupt America's energy companies. That's what Amarova said before she was yanked as comptroller of the currency. You know, you guys did a lot
but she didn't get the
terms
job.
of what Raskin said. No, they didn't get the job, but they're sending the signal. Right. But let me continue. It's John Kerry and Gina McCarthy going to American financiers saying, hey, don't invest in American energy projects. I know for a fact that some of our recipients of American LNG, like in Japan, have been told by Kerry and others to be careful on buying American LNG. And then, of course, it's the whole ESG movement, which, again, you're right, Joe. AIG can do whatever it wants in terms of a free market. But I will tell you this, the American people are getting sick of it. Congress is getting sick of it. When they see companies like that having no problem investing big money in China, propping up the Chinese Communist Party, and then they're going to blackball American workers, Alaskan workers, to produce American energy. You know, there's going to be a reckoning here, and it's a problem.
I'm not going to disagree with you. I actually think there is going to be a reckoning here, but I think the reckoning might be a little bit different than how it's being described. The first thing, and just contextually, oil and gas companies effectively realized in the past decade that they couldn't invest because it didn't make sense. The economics of it didn't make sense. That's not to say that this administration is somehow favorable towards the oil and gas industry. It is not, because they're trying to be favorable towards cleaner energy, and clearly the transition is becoming a problem, and I think people are realizing it's becoming a problem pretty quickly. But that isn't to say that we should give up on that either. And so the question is, what does that middle look like?
Well, Andrew, as you know, both the International Energy Agency and our own EIA have said that the transition is going to take decades, that we are going to need oil and gas for decades, no matter how quickly this transition moves. And if we need oil and gas, then we should produce it from the place that has the highest environmental standards. That's America. That's Alaska. It has the highest labor standards, our country. And we certainly shouldn't be going out begging dictators from countries like Venezuela and Iran to produce more American energy when they're shutting it down in our own country. It makes no sense.
But Senator, so
and I think
there's
one of the
two
things
issues
about
here.
Go ahead.
You know, Jamie Dimon just said yesterday, or maybe the day before, had a meeting in Washington where he said there should be a Marshall Plan for energy. So one of the component parts is, I think, what you're referring to, which is permitting. We should make permitting easier, especially given the current situation we have relative with Russia right now. But beyond that, what else would you do? I mean, are we talking about tax incentives? Are we talking about something even grander?
No, I'm not talking about tax incentives. I'm talking about let the market play out. You know, we had this revolution in natural gas that occurred over the last 2 decades. By the way, as you know, we have reduced greenhouse gas emissions because of that more than any other country, major economy in the world by far. What I'm saying is get the federal government's boot off the neck of American producers. That's with regard to permitting. Think about it, Andrew. FERC just put out a rule that's going to make it much harder to transport and export natural gas. Their job is actually the opposite. And they just put out a rule. You may have seen the hearing that Joe Manchin chaired, where he brought all 5 of the FERC regulators in front of the committee and said, this is ridiculous. It's the same with regard to finance. Now, look, the big energy companies are going to be able to get financing. But what I see in Alaska is smaller, independent companies who have come to me saying they can't get financing. And I think this is due to a lot of pressure from federal regulators and this administration's pressuring of American financial institutions. My view is those financial institutions need to wake up, not take the pressure, and certainly not make grandiose announcements that they're going to blackball investment in America's Arctic, Alaska, when they're at the same time investing major capital in the Chinese Communist Party. Again, I think Congress is getting really tired of this hypocrisy, and I do think there's going to be a reckoning on this, but we need American energy. We're going to need it for decades. We should have the federal government help us produce it, not try to kill it, which is exactly what this administration has done
Senator,
in year 1.
Senator, I have to say, I hear you on everything you're saying on these points, but I think a huge reason that you don't see some of the big companies investing at this point is because there's no rules of the road. There's nothing that tells them that an investment they make today is going to be worth anything 4 years from now, 6 years from now, 8 years from now. And you can't make billions of dollars worth of investment when you know that the two parties can't agree on things, and so it's going to get torn up every 2 to 4 years. Is there any chance that in Washington there could be some sort of central movement. And I think this is what
Yeah.
Jamie Dimon was talking about when he was talking about a Marshall Plan.
Yeah.
Let's get a plan in place that doesn't get ripped up because a different party comes into power. How do we lay things out so that public companies can feel very comfortable investing billions of dollars and not thinking it's going to be lost?
Becky, you're making a great point, and I agree 100% that it is every election seems to have a different approach. But I would say the Biden administration's approach has been particularly egregious. You know, producing American energy independence has been a bipartisan goal of administrations, you know, dating back to the end of World War II. Even President Obama was very supportive of natural gas. So I think what we need to do, particularly now in this new era of what I call authoritarian aggression, led by Xi Jinping and Putin, is to recognize one of our great strengths is American energy. It's also American natural resources.
Senator,
it's also
what do you tell
critical minerals.
Senator, what do you tell the investor class, though, both the private investor class, and by the way, I'd mention, I don't know if you saw the news overnight, Chicago's council banning city investment from oil and gas firms. So you have pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and then private funds around the world that effectively are saying, we don't want to invest in this stuff. What do you do about that?
Well, look, I think that's a small class of activist investors. Matter of fact, I'm meeting with Larry Fink in a couple hours in my office, and I think that the whole ESG movement is not reflective of what the average American wants. Let me just give you, there was a poll recently, I think it said 65% of Americans think we should be producing more oil and gas. And again, I think the average American understands that when you restrict the production of American energy and make it harder to produce, the results are very predictable. What are they? Higher prices at the pump, which are hurting working families, laying off American energy workers, and empowering our adversaries. And oh, by the way, as I mentioned, we have the best record on the environment for producing energy than any place on the planet. If we need energy, we
Senator,
should be
all
producing
this may
it here.
Be true, but you have Larry Fink is building a whole series of funds and marketing funds that effectively exclude these kinds of companies. There are now dozens of firms that are doing the same thing.
Well, look, I mean, one of the things I'm going to talk to Larry Fink about is legislation I'm getting ready to introduce that would take away passive investor firms like his and, you know, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. Look at the amount of capital and shares that they control. It's well over $15 trillion.
So you're going
They actually
after
don't
him.
do any management.
What do you want to do to him? Or
I'm going to just say
BlackRock?
I'm just going to say they shouldn't be able to vote those shares. This is just the next step in Dodd-Frank. You guys might remember when Dodd-Frank made it so that broker-dealers didn't have the right to vote what was called in stocks that they held in street name. Why should these three companies that have monopoly power be able to vote all these shares?
I think for the investors, and the truth is that most retail investors don't vote their shares. I mean, that's the sad reality.
I think we should. I think we should make it clear that the retail investors, the people they hold the stock for, should have the ability to vote the shares. It's distorted the market, as you guys know, tremendously to have these three companies with massive power. You know, they control. They have 88% of the S&P 500. Those three investment firms have the highest amount of shareholdings. That is a distortion of capital markets, and I think that it reflects on the energy policies that we're talking about that are not supported by the average American. We need American energy, and we shouldn't have a few Wall Street firms saying we don't. So this is a big issue. You guys are raising important questions. Yep. But to me, what we need to do is produce American energy from our own country, and we're going to need it for decades.
Wow, that's good. Hey, good luck. That's interesting. You're going to see Larry later, and that is a real issue about you know, voting in his sort of his own personal sort of feelings on a lot of this voting, massive amounts of shares. It's very interesting to be able to do that. I would just say, Senator, just be very glad that Larry's on the morally right side of all these issues. So think if he wasn't, then really be a problem. So just thank your lucky stars that he's right about all this stuff. Senator Sullivan.
Yeah, well, we'll see how morally right he is on a lot of this.
Well,
I'm not so sure.
I mean, at least he may know nothing, but he's certainly not in doubt of the virtue of doing this. Thanks for your time. We'll see you.